It was early November and the sun was already dipping below the horizon as I finished my chores on the farm. To keep my spirits up in the growing dark, I started to whistle a random, tuneless melody. Suddenly, a faint whistle echoed back from the neighboring property, mimicking my own pattern perfectly. I tried to rationalize it as a mockingbird, but the sound was too human, too deliberate. Over the next few days, the whistling followed me, getting clearer and louder every time I stepped outside. One evening, I dropped my keys in the tall grass and muttered a sharp "damn it" under my breath. From the darkness of the neighboring hill, a distorted, gravelly voice echoed back, "Damn it." Driven by a reckless need to know who was trespassing, I climbed the fence and headed into the woods. As I ascended the hill, a foul stench hit me, a sickening mix of rotting garbage and wet dog. I heard the voice again, but this time it was perfectly mimicking my own tone, repeating, "Damn it," over and over. I flicked on my phone's flashlight and shouted that this was private property. The beam illuminated a naked, skeletal figure squatting just yards away, its neck elongated and twisted. Its eyes were impossibly large, reflecting the light like a predator's as it slowly stood up to its full, towering height. It repeated, "Damn it," one last time in my exact voice before I turned and bolted down the hill. I didn't stop until I reached my truck and sped away. The memory of those eyes burned into my mind. Though I still work at the farm, I never whistle anymore, and I pray the whistling from the hill never returns. Some things in the woods are better left ignored, especially those that speak with your own tongue. The silence of the countryside can be a comfort, or it can be a mask for something much darker. I often wonder if that squatter was really just a man, or something that had forgotten how to be human. Every time I hear a twig snap now, I wait for the sound of my own voice to answer back. The terror of that night changed the way I see the world beyond the fence. How could something mimic frustration so perfectly without understanding what it means? The way its neck snapped to look at me, it wasn't a biological movement I recognize. The ribs showing through its skin suggested a hunger that can never be satisfied. I never told my grandfather because I didn't want him to know what lived on the hill. Some secrets are safer kept in the dark where they belong. I lost a sense of security that I don't think I'll ever get back. Now I always make sure the keys are firmly in my hand before I step out of the truck. Every whistle in the wind sounds like a challenge I'm not ready to answer. That thing didn't have clothes, didn't have shoes, but it had my voice. If you hear someone calling your name in the woods, don't answer back. The mimics are real, and they are watching from the places we think are empty. Is it a man who became a beast, or a beast trying to become a man? The smell of it alone was enough to tell me it wasn't natural. I never want to see those black, bottomless eyes ever again. The sound of my own voice coming from its throat still makes my skin crawl. It stood there like a robot waiting for my next move. Nature has a way of producing nightmares that we are not prepared to face. I wish I could forget the way it looked at me. Be careful what you whistle into the dark, because something might just whistle back. While the farmhand's whistle faded into the distance, a new hunt began in the frozen heart of Ohio. Mark checked the safety on his bolt-action rifle while his son Ethan adjusted his thermal goggles. They were tracking a pack of coyotes that had been harassing local livestock for weeks. The tracks they followed were strange, showing a heavy drag mark that didn't match a canine gait. Suddenly, the sharp metallic scent of blood cut through the crisp, freezing air. 10 yards ahead, a fully grown buck lay gutted, its ribcage snapped outward like a blooming flower. No coyote is capable of unhinging a deer's sternum with that much brute force. Ethan pointed his light toward a trail of viscera leading deeper into the valley. At the bottom of the ravine stood the skeletal remains of an 1800s one-room schoolhouse. The heavy wooden door of the schoolhouse hung loosely on a single rusted hinge. Mark signaled for silence as he heard a wet, rhythmic thumping coming from inside. Ethan's heart hammered against his chest as he stepped onto the groaning floorboards. A floorboard snapped with the sound of a gunshot echoing through the hollow room. The wet thumping sound stopped instantly, replaced by a low, vibrating growl. Mark swept his rifle light across the room, illuminating overturned desks and moldy books. In the far corner, a pair of milky white eyes reflected the light with predatory intensity. The creature was crouched atop the remains of a wood stove, its spine curved like a sickle. Mark yelled for Ethan to get back as the entity uncoiled itself with sickening fluidity. It stood nearly 7 feet tall, its pale skin stretched so thin the bones nearly tore through. The creature let out a sound that mimicked a woman's scream, high-pitched and full of agony. Mark pulled the trigger, the deafening blast of the .30-06 filling the small space. The bullet struck the entity's shoulder, but it didn't even flinch as black fluid sprayed the wall. Before Mark could bolt the next round, the rake lunged across the room with impossible speed. A long, jagged claw swiped through the air, catching Mark across his chest and safety vest. Mark was thrown backward, crashing through a row of rotted wooden desks. Ethan screamed his father's name, his flashlight beam dancing wildly around the ceiling. The creature ignored the sun, focusing its predatory gaze entirely on the wounded father. Mark tried to crawl away, his breath coming in ragged, bloody gasps. The rake pinned Mark down with one hand, its weight crushing the life out of his lungs. With a sudden, brutal jerk, the creature drove its claws deep into the man's spine. Ethan watched in paralyzed silence as his father's body went limp on the cold floor. The entity turned its head 180 degrees to look directly at the young man. It began to speak, but the voice that came out was a perfect mimic of Mark's own voice. "Run, Ethan. Run to the truck," the monster croaked in a loving, fatherly tone. Survival instinct finally kicked in, and Ethan bolted out the door into the freezing night. He ran until his lungs burned, the sound of his own name being called behind him. Every time the voice called out, it sounded closer, more distorted and more hungry. He reached the gravel road, but his truck keys were still in his father's pocket back at the schoolhouse. He leaned against the cold metal, realizing he was trapped in the open with no way to escape. From the tree line, dozens of glowing eyes began to emerge, mimicking the sound of a search party. As the rescuers called his name with hollow voices, Ethan realized the hunt had only just begun. The cold mountain air bit into Marcus's lungs as he lay paralyzed under the heavy steel frame of his overturned ATV. He tried to heave the machine off his legs, but the metal only groaned against the unyielding stone. Silence descended over the ridge, broken only by the ticking of the cooling engine. Suddenly, a voice drifted through the pines, sounding exactly like his wife calling him for dinner. He knew she was miles away in the city, yet the tone was perfect down to the slight rasp in her throat. The voice called out again, but this time it looped the same 3 words with a mechanical, rhythmic precision. Marcus fumbled for his sidearm, his fingers slick with cold sweat and hydraulic fluid. A tall, pale limb reached around a trunk 50 feet away, its fingers ending in blackened, needle-like points. The creature stepped into the clearing, revealing a body that looked like a skeleton wrapped in wet parchment. Its face was a nightmare of smooth flesh where a nose should be, with eyes deep-set in hollow pits. Marcus fired a shot into the air, hoping the thunderous crack would scare the beast back into the darkness. The creature didn't flinch. Instead, it opened its hinge-like jaw and perfectly mimicked the sound of the gunshot. It began to lope toward him, its gait a sickening scramble of spider-like movements. Marcus spotted a heavy iron pry bar that had fallen just out of reach during the crash. He screamed in agony as he twisted his torso, feeling the bone in his leg grate against the ATV frame. The mimic stopped 10 feet away, tilted its head, and began to speak in Marcus's own voice. It repeated his screams of pain, but the sound was distorted, like a recording played at the wrong speed. With a final explosive burst of strength, Marcus grabbed the pry bar and jammed it into the mud. He used the bar as a lever, the machine shifting just enough for him to pull his mangled leg free. The mimic lunged, its claws whistling through the air where Marcus's head had been a second before. Marcus rolled down the embankment, his injured leg trailing uselessly behind him like a dead weight. He saw the creature's silhouette at the top of the ridge, outlined by the cold, uncaring moon. It didn't chase him immediately, instead letting out a high-pitched whistle that sounded like a tea kettle. Marcus crawled into a narrow crevice between two massive boulders, his heart hammering against his ribs. He pulled his hunting knife from its sheath, the steel cold and reassuring in his trembling hand. Above him, the sound of heavy wet footsteps echoed as the entity searched the rocks. "Help me, Marcus, please, it's so cold," the creature whispered in his dead father's voice. Marcus bit his lip until it bled, refusing to let even a whimper escape his throat. In the distance, he heard the faint, rhythmic thumping of a search and rescue helicopter. The mimic heard it too, and it hissed with a sound like escaping steam. It began to tear at the rocks with its claws, sending shards of stone raining down on Marcus. Marcus reached into his vest and found his last emergency flare, his fingers shaking as he gripped the pull tab. As the creature's pale face pushed into the gap, Marcus ignited the flare directly into its sunken eyes. The beast shrieked, a sound of 1,000 dying birds, and recoiled from the searing magnesium heat. Marcus crawled out of his hiding spot, the red smoke of the flare acting as a beacon for the approaching chopper. The helicopter's searchlight swept across the ridge, bathing the entire area in a blinding white glare. In the fading red glow of his flare, Marcus saw the creature retreat into the shadows, its long limbs blurring into the trees. Medics descended from the hovering craft, their voices real and warm, a stark contrast to the mimic's hollow lies. As they strapped him into the gurney, Marcus looked down at the dark woods and knew he would never hunt again. The mountain held its secrets, but the scars on his soul would serve as a permanent reminder of the things that hide in the mimicry of men.